Hi, I'm Matthew, and I call myself a skeptical psychic, and I do that because I understand how easy it is to make mistakes about what is real and what is not real. And at the same time, I call myself a psychic. Primarily, number one thing is that I'm making a psychic claim that I'm an experiencer having an experience. That is a claim that you cannot turn, at least as far as I can see, to the objective material world and say, there's the experiencer. Now, because we can't do this, this is a claim that comes from psyche. This is a psychic claim. This is a claim from my mind as to a truth. I think it's fairly clear that Stephen believes that the universe is this cold, dead, well, maybe not cold, right? Let's just say the universe is an unconscious... Oh, I think we could say dead. I mean, to a certain extent, it's got no inner subjectivity. The universe is not conscious. And it's been like that for billions of years until brains or life came into it, and inner subjectivity just kind of popped into existence from nothing. The only thing that you can know to be true, is your inner subjective experience, right? That is the first thing that you know. And in this model, it just pops into existence, spontaneous generation style, out of a dead universe, out of an unconscious universe. And I find that as a worldview to be ridiculous. Now, I will grant Stephen, I feel sick saying this, I'm totally behind evolution. It doesn't mean that we completely understand it. There may be a little bit more going on than random chance, but in terms of just the basic idea of evolution, 100% thumbs up. So can that explain consciousness? Well, we're erring into the content of the video a little bit here, but I'm just trying to say that consciousness can be thought of in terms of inner subjectivity, and it can be thought of in terms of behaviour. That behaviour is a piss-poor explanation of consciousness, but if we look at consciousness purely from behavioural terms, we can account for it, or it looks like we can account for it, by the brain and evolution, and we're done.
The phenomenon of consciousness is no doubt extraordinary. To be aware of and responsive to our surroundings is arguably the most mysterious and important aspect of our lives.
Sorry, Stephen, you've goofed this up right from the start. I know that you're going to affirm this definition of it later on, but that's completely inadequate, and I'll explain why. You see, if we look at this from a behavioural point of view, you've just described a thermostat. A thermostat is aware of and it's responsive to its surroundings in a behavioural definition. A thermostat's conscious, Stephen.
But is it so extraordinary, so special, that it must be the product of divine intellect?
God would have to be conscious. So you can't invent something that already exists. So the idea of it being a product of divine intellect is nonsense right from the get-go. However, if you look at it a different way, you could say that the human experience, right, the human conscious experience, what it is like to have the experience of being a human being, that has come out of the universe. Now, no one disagrees with that, right? I think so. Well, okay, I'm not worried about the people who disagree with that. I'm all for cosmological inflation, formation of planetary systems after stars and supernova, all that wonderful stuff that gets us to life on Earth. But the human experience has evolved. What's it evolved from? Has it evolved from this proto-machinist machine? And I do believe Stephen is a devout proto-machinist. Or has it come from a universe that had some sort of agential consciousness? In which case, the human experience would be a product not necessarily of divine intellect, but of a divine process, a search, some sort of conscious search for being more or doing something new. Just an idea.
This is the argument from consciousness debunked.
No, it isn't. It's been double debunked. Sorry, Stephen.
Likewise to most theological arguments, there are many types of arguments from consciousness, each differing in the premises they use and the way they're conveyed. But in this video we're going to focus on the most popular type.
Many arguments. You pick one of them that you can easily defeat, and you put that on a video saying, "The argument from consciousness debunked." And while you acknowledge that this isn't the case for about 20 to 30 seconds, the rest of the video proceeds as if it were the case still. I know, Stephen, that you have accused other people of strawmanning, and I know that you might not be trying to do that right now, but it does look a lot like it.
That being, arguments from consciousness that assert that neither naturalism or materialism can provide an adequate explanation of consciousness, but that theism can.
However, I will work with that argument anyway, Stephen. That is an argument that I can go for, right? Arguments from consciousness that assert that neither naturalism or materialism can provide an adequate explanation of consciousness, but that theism can. Well, alright, let's have a look at the way that I look at the world. Because the universe is conscious and we're dissociations from it, I don't have a problem having to explain inner subjectivity. That's just fundamental. It doesn't appear from nowhere. I have no burden of proof to explain how inner subjectivity farts into existence with brains. What I have to explain is how brains cause a dissociation of inner subjectivity from the rest of the world. And I think that's a far more addressable issue, an issue that we can get more traction on than your belief system of Protomachinism, Stephen. So, technically speaking, what I believe is theism. Technically, it's theism, because I'm essentially believing in a conscious creator.
So, to present this argument in its syllogistic form, it is a fact that human consciousness exists. This fact can be adequately explained within a theistic framework, i.e., one which posits God's existence.
So the idea of Cosmopsychism is the idea that we can have one consciousness and then we can dissociate from that to explain other consciousness. And that's a framework that works to explain inner subjectivity, and naturalism or materialism just does not account for inner subjectivity, and so it will never be able to explain on its own inner subjectivity. Sort of almost by definition. Now, you've got an alternative. If you blend naturalism or materialism with panpsychism, maybe that's all you need, right? Maybe that's all you need. That is what I'm doing, though. All right.
Whereas it cannot be adequately explained within a naturalistic or materialistic framework, i.e., one which lacks a belief in God's existence. Hence, there is a fact that only theism can adequately explain.
Okay, we're starting to go into the territory here where the argument isn't being used to promote an idea as being more rational, to engage further discussion, but being used as because it's absolutely definitely the case. And I'm not behind that second part. I'm behind I think it's more rational and let's have a chat. Stephen isn't going for that, though.
Therefore, God exists. To take on this argument, it's critical that we first define what consciousness means, and preferably within 10 hours. But jokes aside, its basic definition is the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings.
Like a thermostat.
Which is indeed what most of us mean when we say consciousness.
No, it isn't, because not everyone would think that the consciousness is in a thermostat. We don't think that a thermostat's conscious. I'm a cosmopsychist, right? I'm an agential cosmopsychist. I believe the universe is conscious, and I don't believe that thermostats are conscious, Stephen. And I don't believe that thermostats are conscious because I don't see how we would have a dissociation from the inner subjectivity that exists elsewhere, right? The brains have to be doing something pretty interesting to create that dissociative experience. That experience of just being you in the universe and being separate from it. I don't believe thermostats have that. I just don't. I mean, maybe you can persuade me that thermostats are conscious, Stephen. Yeah, I would love that conversation.
But the reason this needs to be nailed down immediately is because many proponents of the argument from consciousness attempt to implicitly define it to mean something that it's not.
You know, as much as you can smuggle something in, Stephen, you can attempt to smuggle something out too.
Such as a transcendent part of the human personality.
Oh! Inner subjectivity. I mean, come on. Inner subjectivity. Consciousness. You haven't mentioned inner subjectivity. It would have gotten in the way of your argument for sure, but it's there. It's like Sam Harris. Oh no, he does and he doesn't, right? Sam Harris says everyone has this irreducible subjective experience, but Sam Harris will go further and say there's no subject. How can you affirm inner subjective experience while at the same time taking out the subject?
And in doing this, they're attempting to smuggle immaterial and unnatural properties into the definition of consciousness.
Is it possible you smuggled them out, Stephen? Is it possible you smuggled them out? And I think that the fact that you seem to suggest by your definition that thermostats are conscious, might give us a clue that you've missed something out of this.
Which is essentially a backhand way of begging the question.
Right. This fallacy is invalid because you used a bad definition of consciousness. So, no, that is a fallacy debunked.
Hence, however one defines consciousness, they must first acknowledge that every shred of evidence has so far supported the statement that...
I feel, Stephen, like you realise that you've committed this huge gaffe in defining consciousness, and now we're going to sweep it under the rug by doing something else. Let's have a look.
Consciousness is a product of the mind, which in turn is a product of the brain.
Fantastic. Okay. This is your belief, as far as I can see, that inner subjectivity just pops into existence with brains. This is your protomachinism showing. I don't think it's a falsifiable belief system, Stephen. I don't think that there's any supporting evidence for it, Stephen. You could make the argument that if someone's brain gets damaged in a particular way, it will affect their consciousness, right? I'm fully aware of that. That is not data that affirms one model over another.
There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that our consciousness is independent of our bodies. None.
Well, that's rubbish. There is evidence. You could question the evidence. You could say that the evidence was dubious. You could talk about the evidence, but to say there's no evidence is fake news, Stephen. It's fake news.
With that said, let's get on with it. Let's debunk the argument from consciousness. In my opinion, the first objection to be stated is that premise 3 doesn't follow from premise 2, making the entire argument a non sequitur. Even if we were to assume that theism can adequately explain consciousness, and that naturalism can't, it by no means follows from this alone that only theism can explain consciousness.
Essentially, by Stephen setting up the argument, or choosing, or picking the argument, which asserts that God must be true because of this argument, rather than, hey, look, it looks like God's the most rational explanation, because he's picked the weaker argument, he can now put the fallacies on because of his own decision, right? He could have picked a stronger argument, one that I'm presenting, that this is just suggestive rather than conclusive, but he's not. He's picked the weaker argument, and now he's pointing at problems with the weaker argument that he's picked. Well done, Stephen.
To name a few alternatives, Deism and Panpsychism can both explain consciousness within their frameworks.
Yes, and Deism is good. Deism is, honestly, seriously, Stephen, not taking the piss here at all. Deism is a great suggestion. Pantheism, on the other hand, I think that might be a form of theism. I think there's something in the name that's giving it away.
And so right from the outset, the argument from consciousness isn't coherent. Its conclusion doesn't follow from its premises, even if they were all valid.
But the conclusion that it looks more likely, or that it looks like a better way of looking at things, in the absence of another suggestion, does kind of make Protomachinism, the belief that the universe is like this dead, unconscious machine that inner subjectivity just kind of farts into, it does make that proto-machinist viewpoint look bad in comparison.
Which, so far as arguments go, is pretty damn pathetic. But while we're on the topic of alternative worldviews that can explain consciousness, the fact that the argument from consciousness posits only naturalism and theism as valid options, without justifying why these two options are the only available, means that it commits a black and white fallacy.
Okay, so I accept the fact that you've presented deism, but you're not providing alternatives to this, so you're not helping the conversation evolve, you're just mocking the other side for fixating on a couple of points.
Furthermore, and by extension, this also means that the argument hasn't fulfilled its burden of proof. It hasn't substantiated the claim that only naturalism and theism are valid options.
I don't make such a claim, I don't have such a burden of proof.
A third flaw to raise is that even if the conclusion of the argument was valid, all it would prove is that theism alone can explain consciousness. It wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a specific religion is true.
And I, for one, am very happy with that, Stephen. I think that's quite a good outcome.
And as Christopher Hitchens once said, even if you've established deism, you've still got all of your work ahead of you to be a theist.
I don't agree with that. I think that I like to be as parsimonious and as logical and as rational with the way that I look at this as possible. And I say to myself that if I'm mind and I'm represented in what you see by my brain, that my brain is a complete or incomplete representation of my mind, and by extension, in some fashion, all matter looks like it's some sort of representation of mind, and that's just parsimonious. If you want to disagree with that, you have to have two sorts of matter. The sort of matter that is representative of mind, and the sort of matter that is not representative of mind. Okay, where's your burden of proof for that? Right, so where I'm going with this is we've got to get to theism from deism. Depends on you. If you have choices, then why should the conscious systems around you also not have choices? It's if you don't have choices, then deism looks more rational. So if you don't believe if you don't believe in free will, if you don't believe that you make choices, then deism is the way to go. If you believe in free will, if you believe that you make choices, and those are different things, right? Those are different things. You could go for will instead of free will. I'll acknowledge that, and I'll grant that. But if you believe that you make choices, then it's only fair to assume the same for the universe. Just a logical extrapolation.
Hence, even if it was valid, the argument from consciousness doesn't remotely support a specific theistic religion.
That's a positive for me.
A fourth spectacular flaw that the argument from consciousness commits is a giant argument from ignorance.
This is an argument from ignorance. You're an argument from ignorance. Okay, you're not an argument from ignorance. I'm just saying that because I'm annoyed, Stephen. I'm annoyed because why, just because I'm making an argument from consciousness, do you assume that I'm some sort of evolution denier? I know this is where it's going. Sod off, Stephen. I'm not. Evolution's great. What's wrong with evolution?
If we cut to the core of what's being asserted, it's essentially that because we can't explain consciousness from a naturalistic framework, which, by the way, we can.
By the way, you can't.
Theism must be correct.
I won't say must.
Or put more directly, the argument from consciousness is founded on the statement that...
Wait for it. This is the epic fail of the video, in my humble opinion.
We don't know how to explain consciousness, therefore God.
So I understand that this is a very frustrating thing to come across. We don't know X, therefore God. We don't know X, therefore God. It's like the car crash moment of the video here, where we just sort of go, therefore, what? No. therefore God. No, that's not what I believe at all. That is a complete misrepresentation. Right. The reason that theism is a framework that can be used to explain inner subjectivity is because we're positing inner subjectivity as fundamental within the theistic framework. That's an explanation. What you've got on the screen at the moment, Stephen, is not an explanation, and... A
fifth flaw, and to get back to the erroneous assertion that naturalism can't explain consciousness, is that it can. It's called natural selection.
Stephen's now going to explain to us how natural selection can explain behaviour, which it can. He's not going to touch on a subjectivity. Oh, he is. He's going to smuggle it in.
At the risk of boring you through repetition, natural selection is the process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. To state it very, very simply, the nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. Feelings evolved to...
Whoa! Feelings evolved! What's having the feelings? The feelings in consciousness? Is something aware of the feelings? Can feelings exist without anyone to feel them? Whoa, very zen. This is inner subjectivity being smuggled in.
Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Awareness evolved to make sense of these feelings.
Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Let's just take that back to the thermostat. So, thermostats have feelings, right? Because in order for thermostats to engage when the temperature drops to a predetermined point, or to disengage when it gets too hot, they have to feel. Thermostats have to have feelings. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to switch off and on.
And consciousness evolved to allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings.
Whoa! And so consciousness is last. So feelings and awareness were there first, and then consciousness came into it later. Like, there were feelings that were happening in a nothing. Like, there was no person to feel the feelings, but they just kind of happened anyway. And then awareness evolved to make sense of those feelings? Is that what awareness, like, making sense of feelings? Jeez. Oh, man. See me after class, Stephen. This is terrible.
Allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings. And finally, a fifth flaw that many of the proponents of the argument from consciousness commit is a personal incredulity fallacy. While I implied earlier that all of the proponents of this argument commit an argument from ignorance fallacy, that's not always true. Some proponents will appeal to ignorance and will indeed commit an argument from ignorance, but others won't appeal to ignorance and will instead simply dismiss evolution by natural selection because they can't personally understand it, and hence they'd be committing a personal incredulity fallacy.
As far as I can see here, Stephen, your entire video is a personal incredulity fallacy. I don't think you've understood what it is that you're trying to debunk here. I really don't.
So, to recap, the argument from consciousness is flawed because...
So this way of bringing up fallacies as points turns this video into... It's sort of an encouragement, in my view, to see this as a point scoring exercise. So let's treat it as a point scoring exercise. Just for the time being, let's indulge this particular way of thinking.
It's a non sequitur.
Okay, it's only a non sequitur if you are asserting that there couldn't possibly be any other way of explaining it, which I'm not doing.
It commits a black and white fallacy.
Again, same thing as before. I'm not suggesting there aren't other possible options. We're trying to have a conversation where we're figuring out what the most rational thing is, and to me, Agential Cosmopsychism, a form of Panpsychism, looks like the most rational way to explain the world and include inner subjectivity into our scientific understanding of the universe.
It doesn't support a specific religion.
Something I'm very happy about. I think that's probably for the best.
It completely ignores evolution by natural selection.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I'm perfectly happy with the idea that the experience of being human has evolved
and, depending on the delivery of the proponent, it commits an argument from ignorance or a personal incredulity fallacy.
I understand. I have a basic understanding of evolution. I'm not disputing evolution. I'm disputing the power that evolution has to create inner subjectivity from nothing in an unconscious, unaware universe. I'm disputing your crypto belief of protomachinism, Stephen. I'm quite happy with evolution. What I have a problem with is that it doesn't provide an explanation for inner subjectivity. It provides an explanation for conscious behaviour, but doesn't tackle the hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers has pointed out. And that wraps this video up. And I need you to understand something. I don't think Stephen's a bad person. I do think that he's actually really quite smart and quite capable, but I think that he is ideologically possessed by protomachinism. I think that he has put his heart perhaps a little bit too much in Sam Harris, and I think that Stephen has failed to spot the incoherent parts of Harris's, I don't even really want to call them teachings, let's call them what Sam Harris believes to be true. So I would love to have a real serious conversation treating Stephen as a proper human being, as someone like myself, sort of like a brother, I suppose. But I'm also really aware of how ticked off this video's made me, and I'm kind of aware that I don't necessarily come off as the most tolerant, understanding person when reviewing this. This is how the video has made me feel, and maybe I should be more in charge of my own feelings, but at this point, no. It's too hard to make YouTube videos to second guess yourself all the time, and that has to be a contributing factor that would, something that if I assign it to me, I have to assign it to Stephen as well, you know. It's easy to make a video that you might want to change your mind on later, and I owe Stephen a courtesy of allowing him to change his mind. Jeez, of course I do, and I should be prepared to be wrong as well. So with that sort of disclaimer after me going all the video, that's what I think. That is the argument from consciousness from Stephen, from Rationality Rules, double debunked. Thank you for watching.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature's made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
To solve the mind-body problem, I assume consciousness is fundamental. Then my burden is to show that all of physics comes out of it, and it does.